Man, I had something in my head. I fucked that right up.
It's okay. Sorry, Brody.
All right, let's go again. All right. Today we have a very fun interview for you guys. He's written jokes for Jay Leno. He's been on the circuit for a long time. We have the funny man himself, Frank King. Welcome to the show.
Woo! Woo!
How are you, man? How you doing?
I am cooler than the backside of the pillow, baby.
I gotta ask, man. Suicide, depression, and a comedian. How does that work?
Good question. Pretty much every keynote I ever do, I begin that way because that, Brody, is the elephant in the room. A comedian talking about depression and suicide. How does that work? Actually, I think a comedian's a good choice. Tell you why. If you think about the world's first comedians, they were the court jesters. Court jesters' job, speak truth to power on behalf of the powerless with humor. I believe I speak truth to the power of mental illness on behalf of those often powerless in its grip with humor. I believe where there's humor, there's hope. Where there's laughter, there's life. That nobody dies laughing. And depression and suicide run in my family. My grandmother died by suicide. My mother found her. My great aunt died by suicide. My mother and I found her. I was 4 years old. I screamed for days. And if you're already hardwired for depression and thoughts of suicide, and you're that close to an actual suicide, chances of you seriously considering taking your life later in life go up. And sure enough, April 2010, last recession, wife and I lost everything we'd worked for in 25 years in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. And that's when I learned what the barrel of my gun tasted like. Spoiler alert, I did not pull the trigger.
I'm glad you didn't pull the trigger, but that's a pretty dark story you got there. And the fact that you've actually turned that into something positive to actually make people laugh. I common stories like this of people that actually hide their depression and their anxiety through humor. You look at the Robin Williams of the world, spent his entire life making people laugh, but on the inside, like, he was just the most unhappy guy on the planet.
I think he's living with bipolar, actually, although he never talked about it out loud. He joked about his substance abuse disorders, treatment and recovery at length, but never a mention of depression, thoughts of suicide. It may have been because, Brody, if you're going to make a movie in L.A. or wherever, the production company buys a life insurance policy on you in case you die of any reason, any cause during production, so they can recover their costs. If you tell the life insurance agent you've been having thoughts of suicide, they might not be in a hurry to write that life insurance policy for you. So that may be why he hid what I believe was bipolar disorder for his entire life. I hid it, Brody, until I was 55.
Oh, wow.
I came out of the mental health closet on my first TEDx stage. My wife didn't know, my friends, my family. I came out as depressed and suicidal. And when my wife was going to play the YouTube video and it posted, I said, wait a minute, don't hit play yet. I want to tell you about half a dozen things you don't know about me that I don't want you to learn for the first time on that video.
Oh, wow.
So people with mental illness are good actors. I've got a Screen Actors Guild card for a reason. We tend to cover things up to save others, don't want to be a burden. What are they going to do anyway? So
let's take a step back. Let's look at your history prior to you thinking about taking your own life. Like, when was the first time that you thought, not even when you were diagnosed with depression, but like, when did you actually think, like, something isn't quite right with the way that I'm thinking?
I was in my first marriage. It was in 1984, I do believe, January 84. Driving down Highway 163 South in San Diego about 5 in the afternoon. I was married and miserable, although she was a lovely woman. I was selling insurance, great business, but not for me, and I was miserable. And I was not doing what I believed I was born to do, which was stand-up comedy. I wasn't going to open mic nights. And I realized if I didn't change something and fast, sooner rather than later, I was going to kill myself. So my second thought was very empowering. Wait a minute. I can divorce my wife, quit my job, try comedy. If it works, great. If it doesn't, hell, I can always kill myself. So that's the subject of my fourth TEDx talk, Suicide, the Secret of My Success, Dead Man Talking.
I don't even know where to go after that one. Shit.
Yeah, and you know what, Brody? I don't. In my third TED Talk, which is called Mental with Benefits, the Evolutionary Advantages of Mental Illness,
yeah,
I tell the audience, look, I don't think I'm broken. I think I was made this way. I firmly believe that my depression and thoughts of suicide are simply the flip side of my creativity and imagination. It's the same wiring. It's the same brain. It's got to be. And because I kept bumping into people who had a mental illness or two who were amazing in other ways, writers, directors, comedians, actors. I thought this cannot be a coincidence. And sure enough, there's a laundry list of people who have mental illness who are notable, famous, wealthy, whatever.
So you think that your mental illness that you had was more based on your biological makeup rather than the situations that you're in or your environment?
Oh, yes, very much. Up until the time of the bankruptcy, that was a whole different story. My depression was never situational. I was most depressed in some of the best times in my life. It makes no sense, but that's major depressive disorder. That's a very common symptom. You're depressed, but I had money in the bank. The condo we were living in were paid off. I had bookings on the calendar. A lovely wife. It's just everything was going swimmingly. I wanted to jump off the bridge.
So you didn't have any of these thoughts when growing up as a kid or as a teenager? You weren't feeling like you're depressed or down, or the family history even? You didn't think that something might have been a little bit off there?
I wasn't really aware of my family history. I knew at some point that my grandmother died by suicide. I didn't have any conscious memory of discovering my great aunt because it was so horrific. And I'll share it with you if you like, but warn your listeners that if you're easily triggered, we're going to cover something that could raise strong emotions. You might want to go to the bathroom for a minute and a half, come back. My mother couldn't reach my great aunt on the phone, and given my grandmother's history and our history of mental illness, my mother got very worried, so she bundled me into the car at 4 years old, drove over to my great aunt's apartment, let ourselves in, nothing out of place till we got to the kitchen, and then all the food that should have been in the refrigerator, the milk, the butter, the eggs, the cheese, was on the counter. And Brody, it wasn't a modern refrigerator. This is 1960. It was an old Loctite with a latch.
The old avocado ones?
Yes.
Yeah.
Whatever ones. If you crawl in and pull the door to behind you, you cannot get out. And that's what my great aunt had done. She decided to end her life. She crawled in the refrigerator, pulled the door to behind her, and apparently at some point changed her mind and tried to claw her way out.
Whoa.
My mother, not realizing this, me hanging onto her skirt tails, walks over and swings the refrigerator door open. My great aunt falls out and pins me to the floor. We are face to face, and her face is frozen in that last moment of terror. And the family created a legend, a myth, that they were told if Frank ever asks, you say, when your mom opened the door, your great aunt was sitting there in the refrigerator serenely with her hands folded in prayer. And in 2012, I repeated that story to a cousin of mine who's 10 years older, who was well aware of what had happened. And he goes, wait a minute. Serene, folded in prayer, my ass, the old bat fell out on you. And it all came rushing back, Brody, from wherever it had been hidden and walled off. All of a sudden, I was there again.
I have so many questions here. So during this period of time, were you seeing a therapist, and did this story ever come up?
No, I've never seen a therapist. I am self-diagnosed. I co-wrote 4 books on men's mental health with 2 co-authors, a psychologist, Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas, and a therapist, Sarah Gare. And I didn't realize what I was living with was major depressive disorder and chronic suicidal ideation until the 3 of us were chatting over coffee one day, and I'm describing my symptoms, and they're open. And they allowed us how, Frank? Those things have a name. Yeah, you're crazy. So I got classic symptoms. Let me give you an example. Chronic suicidal ideation for me and people in my tribe means that suicide's always on the menu as a solution for problems large and small, a coping mechanism. My car broke down a couple of years ago. I had 3 thoughts unbid. Get it fixed, buy a new one, or hell, I could just kill myself. That's chronic suicidal ideation. Now, the upside of telling that story every time I speak, Brody, every time I've spoken since 2014, there's been at least one person in the audience who has chronic suicidal ideation, and invariably they do not know it has a name. that it's a thing. They think they're just some kind of freak and completely alone. And a young woman came up at a college presentation, said, "Thanks for your keynote." I said, "You're welcome." She said, "But I got to tell you, it made me weep." I said, "How did it make you weep?" She goes, "You know your story about the car? Get it fixed, buy a new one, kill yourself?" I go, "Yeah." She goes, "I've been having those thoughts all my life. I didn't know that had a name. I thought I was some kind of freak and completely alone. And when I heard you say that out loud, I realized for the first time in my life that I am not alone, and I wept."